Welcome, everyone. We're going to give our listening audience a few minutes to join. I'm so pleased to welcome everyone to our panel today on racial justice in DC. What's next? What does it mean for our city? So as we go live today, I have three amazing guests. We're going to be standing by as people join. I know that some people are still working right now or maybe just getting off of work. But we're really thrilled to be hosting this first of many conversations about what's real and true for us as DC residents and as advocates for the people of Washington, DC. As you know, there's been some exciting news just the last 24 hours. Kamala Harris has been selected as the vice presidential running mate on the Democratic ticket. Woohoo! Can't stop cheering that on. Let me tell you, that is just music to my ears every day. So I want to, again, give people a chance to join. As they start joining, I'll say a few words about myself. My name is Mónica Palacio. I'm running to win the DC Council seat, the at-large seat this November. And I've been in this race now for almost 7 months. It's been quite a journey. And I have invited three people that I greatly admire and respect, who are true friends and true advocates, warriors on the front line, as I call them, to speak to us today about this topic of racial justice. So if you're joining us, this is our panel on racial justice in DC, what's next? So I would like to ask my panelists today to take 2 minutes each to introduce yourselves, your current role, your experience, titles, whatever you'd like to share, so that we can kick off with our questions in just a few minutes. Why don't we start with George Jones?
Oh, I see. Age before beauty, right?
Maybe this time.
So yes, I'm George Jones. I'm the CEO of Bread for the City, a nonprofit that is here based in Washington, D.C. We have two community centers. One where I'm sitting here at our Southeast Center in east of the Anacostia River. We also have a community center on 7th Street in Northwest D.C. Bread for the City tackles poverty in two ways, really. We both sort of try to meet challenges as they sort of appear to us. They come to our door, if you will. So we provide food, clothing, medical, legal, social services. We provide a holistic array of services to community members who come to us looking for really some redress from the burden that poverty really, places on folks living in the communities where we serve. And then we also try to fight poverty by fighting it systemically. So we provide support to our community members around advocacy and community organizing. We work with our community members to try to figure out how to dismantle what we believe the driving force behind the persistent poverty, which is systemic racism. What do we do to deal with that? And, the one thing I'll say about this challenge, and one of the reasons I'm excited about this conversation is, it was about 8 years ago, right after Trayvon Martin was killed, when my staff came to me and said, hey, what are we going to do about this issue of Black people being killed? And my staff was hurting. And one of the questions they asked me, I'll never forget this, was, have you ever asked yourself why the only people who come to Bread for the City are people who call it Black and other people who call it? Why is it that every person in Washington, D.C. who's living in poverty essentially is a person of color? It was an important question, and there were some serious answers to that question. Bread for the City ever since has been on this journey to sort of understand, to do what we call a racial equity analysis about why there's such an intersection between poverty and race, particularly in cities like Washington, D.C. So Bread for the City is all about trying to do its own work in an anti-racist way, trying to figure out how to be a catalyst for and a voice for creating an anti-racist city. So again, I'm really pleased to be a part of this conversation, and hopefully this is our time. This is our moment. I think some of us have been waiting 50 years for an opportunity like this to see the civil rights movement revitalized and reborn. And so I'm excited about this conversation and about the work ahead of us.
Thank you, George. Thanks for being here today. Now we'll turn to Jessica.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Sandoval, and I lead a campaign to end solitary confinement in U.S. jails and prisons. We're a national campaign housed here in Washington, D.C. And, our goal really is to advocate for people who are behind bars that often get left behind in these conversations around racial equity and policing and lots of other conversations that don't include our incarcerated populations, our families. We're really excited to be here, to have this conversation with you all, to be engaged with these other really great DC leaders. And Monica, thanks for having us here. I'm excited to dive in.
Thank you, Jessica. And last but not least, Mr. Greg Jackson.
Hello, everybody. I'm Greg Jackson with the Community Justice Action Fund. Actually been a DC resident for 12 years now. I come from a place called Fluvanna County, Virginia, where racism was right in your face. My next door neighbor had a Confederate flag. Some of my classmates would wear the Confederate flag on the front of their caps in class every day. But when I moved to DC, I saw a whole different form of racism, the systematic racism that has concentrated poverty, destroyed our schools, and really fueled a cycle of violence and trauma that has hurt so many. In 2013, about 7 years ago, when walking home, I was caught in the middle of a crossfire and was shot and injured, and spent about 6 months in recovery. And then, when I recovered, I'll never forget, one of my nurses in MedStar said, there's so many people just like you that come through these doors and go right back into our communities in Washington, D.C. every day. And that really struck a nerve, but it also struck some activism spirit in me. And so I started to dig in and work locally to help address gun violence in communities of color and Black communities. And then also eventually I wound up working for a Community Justice Action Fund, which our entire mission is to end the gun violence in Black and Brown communities by uplifting community-based solutions and really centering the survivors and the community to bring about the change, as opposed to purely the law enforcement crime control approach, which we've seen has not worked for too long. So excited to be here, excited to talk specifically about how we end gun violence in our communities in DC and nationwide.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick us off with our first question. And that is, so much has happened in our lives here in DC the last 7 months. There's been so many kind of apocalyptic, epic, and inspiring events. I'd like to open it up for each of you to share from your view, what are some of the events that have taken the conversation from civil rights to racial justice, right? From ending police brutality to abolition. What are some of the key events or moments that you've seen? I know that the increase in homicide and gun violence for me is constantly, a code red alert that we need to, invest and strike to protect our children, protect our communities. But what are some of the events that have been significant to you?
Well, maybe I'll start again. I think that obviously, the obvious thing is, the George Floyd murder on TV, almost like some, sort of reality, perverse reality show, left us all just stunned. And we know it wasn't the first time that a Black person was killed by the police, the first time they were killed on TV, but there was something about, we use the word systematic. It was something about, it was almost a systematic murder that we witnessed that, you, on the one hand, you couldn't turn away from, but on the other hand, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we watched a Black man essentially lynched before us. And so the fact that that was a trigger, it goes without saying, but again, it wasn't the only one. But one of the things that I say about that, I think it also, there's this sort of intersection with the pandemic itself, which left more people to see it, which, in a lot of ways, it was already the narrative about Black people dying from the pandemic more frequently, disproportionately being affected by it. Not surprising to many of us who've been in this work. But I guess the thing that really strikes me is as important to sort of underscore is that, poverty was, and racism was always lethal. We saw it in the murder of George Floyd, but it has been lethal all of my lifetime and maybe since the founding of this country. And so I'm just really glad that we have an opportunity now to keep it front and center until something is done, until change is really demanded.
Yeah, if I can jump in next, I mean, I think with specifically George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I mean, we've seen how an overwhelming intensity of policing can go wrong, you know, and I just know when I was shot on 7th and O Street, you know, before an ambulance arrived, 2 police officers arrived. When my ambulance took me to the hospital, I had to talk to 3 different investigators before I could even meet my doctor. And that just shows you how we deal with violence, how we deal with crime, but more importantly, how we deal with Black people in America. George Floyd was a $20 counterfeit bill, and 3 officers responded and took his life. And I think that is not, you know, when you see stuff like that, especially as Black people in America and Black men especially, you know, we don't necessarily see George Floyd. We see all those traumatic memories of when we went through something very similar. You know, I've been held at gunpoint 5 times by the police wrongfully. So we always pull from that trauma. We pull from those experiences, and that's what ignited a lot of fires in folks. Even when you look at Ahmaud Arbery, someone who was jogging and was shot and killed, and that was considered by the prosecutors potentially a justified homicide due to stand your ground laws. I mean, there were literally legal laws and policies that protected those men after they gunned someone down so horrifically. And, you know, we're in a time where folks just are fed up and they're empowered. And especially in DC, where you have so many Black communities that are together, that are organized. When you think about just the Ahmaud Arbery situation, we have the largest run club in the world, in the District Running Collective. The largest Black running club in the world is based in DC. And so you cannot expect movements like that to not react locally and not put pressure on our local leaders to make change. So I think those are some of the big sparks.
Jessica, what about you?
Yeah, you know, I think the pandemic has really hit home for many people, particularly in the community I work in, and for those behind bars. I think, you know, what we've seen play out both on the pandemic and racial justice side of these, what I would call 2 pandemics really on our hands, is that, you know, the population that I advocate on behalf of is those that are in our criminal legal system, but who are in solitary confinement, which is the deepest kind of part of the legal system in the penal system. And it also is the most torturous. You know, no piece of evidence, empirical evidence, reporting has told us otherwise. And so we know that solitary really has been an accepted and widely unchallenged practice. And I think during this humanitarian crisis, we're seeing this play out on a broad scale. You know, and so many people, in addition to defunding the police, are calling for decarceration of 2.2 million people in this country's legal system. And even in this pandemic crisis, we are not seeing the kind of reductions that we believe we need to have on a large scale. We're really concerned with the alarming trends that we do see coming out of this. Just for some, you know, background, before the pandemic, there had been 10 years of really hard-won advocacy fights on the solitary confinement front, because our community and our advocacy, we know that solitary confinement is the handmaiden to mass incarceration. You can't have 2.2 million people behind bars without the efficiency that solitary confinement provides, which is locking down people in isolated units for 23 hours a day, every day, for years. And I think that that kind of systematic approach to controlling people has kind of bared its head during this process before before COVID, with these kind of hard fought wins and gains that we'd seen around the advocacy, we had reduced the solitary population over the 10 years somewhere between 20 and 40%. So we were somewhere down to 60, maybe 80,000 people in solitary confinement, which is still significant. But where we're hovering right now is probably closer to 300,000 or 400,000 people. So we've seen a 500% increase in solitary confinement. And what we've also heard anecdotally from our families who have loved ones on the inside and from those living there, they're telling us that the corrections guards are taking these racial justice protests very personally. They feel and see themselves very much as an extension of law enforcement. And they're brutalizing people behind the bars because of what's playing out in the streets. And they're, threatening people with their lives to say, like, there's no cameras in here. No one's going to save you. You're not going to become a hashtag. I can kill you in here and nobody would know. And I think that, we have to have a broader conversation about not just how we, defund the police and reprioritize those investments, but how this conversation goes beyond just our street communities into our broader kind of community continuum that includes prisons. We have a jail in our backyard, right? We're no stranger to what it means to have a corrections facility in our community. Our folks are coming home. We know this. And do we want them coming home better treated, less harmed, or do we want them coming home to living in these facilities where it's about punishment? And we, I think, have to really challenge this punishment paradigm, and we can talk more about what that looks like in our conversation. But that's really, I think, what this means to me, is how we dismantle these other structures that allow us to have a system as large as we do. And I think that the conversation is really having us look at if we really need all these people incarcerated, and asking for, people to really evaluate who is in their system. So that's, I think, really what's been the challenge for our work, and where things have been standing out in the last 7 months, as you mentioned.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, let's continue, Greg.
Yeah, and I wanted to add one thing. I mean, when we specifically look at gun violence, I think everyone has seen how it is spiraling almost out of control at this point. And it's not because we have less police officers. It's not because we're arresting less people. It's because the root causes that fuel the cycle of violence are being intensified right now. People are in some of the worst economic situations ever. They have extremely low access to education, access to food resources, access to safe spaces. We underestimate how important rec centers are and schools are to keeping our children and keeping our adults safe. And all of those institutions that were built up to help, keep the peace and keep people in safe spaces in tough times when you are dealing with concentrated poverty and concentrated trauma, have all collapsed. And we're just seeing the worst of what happens when you don't invest in our communities. I live in Anacostia, the street right behind me, at a cookout I go to every year. Devon McNeil was shot and killed watching the fireworks. A 12-year-old shot and killed watching fireworks. And as terrible as that was, the worst part was the next day watching 30 kids from that neighborhood marching down their street, Black Lives Matter. And it's that, we should be creating, we should be building and supporting and creating a community where at least our most vulnerable, our youth, are protected, where they can at least be celebrated without the threat of being shot and killed while just being outside. And so I think with this COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of us are looking at the health risks and health concerns, but we're not paying enough attention to all of the support and resources that have been shut down. And I think now is the time more than ever that we have to pour into those resources, whether that's housing, whether that's additional support for education, whether that's additional stimulus to keep people staying afloat, or else it's going to continue to spiral into what we're seeing now. I mean, it's it is an extremely dark time for so many communities. And unfortunately, it's the same communities that are being traumatized over and over again. And COVID-19 is just exposing what we've overlooked and neglected for too long.
Yes, and I think George, you one of your phrases was poverty and racism have always been lethal, right?
That's right.
So many of our communities have been more vulnerable to COVID-19 because they've never had the right health care, right? Or they've never had safe and healthy housing. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, and I always I want to be a little careful when I think about the gun violence and the trauma associated with that, because those things are real. And to be honest with you, when your loved one is the one who is just hurt, forget dying. There's no sort of justifying or rationalizing anything about that. But I will say that in these communities, even where gun violence sometimes spikes, and sometimes those stories get so much prominence, in terms of the media, that they paint the communities as being only that. And the truth of the matter is, even during those tough times and when you have these horrific things that play themselves out in communities, when I talk to people, they're still fixated on how am I going to house my kids and get them educated, and they want to keep them safe, but they also want to keep them living at a standard that they can thrive, that they can go beyond just survival mode. And so, those of us who are in, powerful places, from the mayor on down to folks who are running nonprofits. I mean, the challenge really is to double down when we hear about this violence that takes place in our community, is to double down on making sure that we can interrupt the kind of systemic oppression that is the underlying piece in those communities. When people, study after study shows that when people have enough to eat and they have a decent place to live, when they live in communities that are healthy, that the behavior is healthy in those communities. And that's our challenge. And it's not policing. It is what are we willing to do to ensure that kids over here in Southeast DC and the families that they live in live in the same kind of economic standards that we have across town. We have got to be willing to tackle the economic disparities and insecurity that people are experiencing in the city. It is time to do something about the fact that you can't have one part of the city with 81 times the wealth of another part of the city, one collection of people in this city. If we deal with the income disparities in this community, and they're tough, by the way, but it isn't that complicated. We have to deal with that. Families will take care of the rest. If we deal with this sort of injustice around, and it all is rooted. Somebody asked me the other day when I talk about a racial equity analysis, what does that mean to me? It means that you understand from 1619 to 2020 how we got here. Mm-hmm. You don't understand it as being some isolated one-off incident that takes place, but that you can unpack, and that's a possible thing to do, to understand why people of color have been in the sites for 400 plus years. And it's time for us now to do something to change that. And it starts with, even before dealing with violence, it starts with economic security, that when people have enough, they can take care of the rest themselves. And we've got to be committed to making sure our communities have enough.
Yeah. And if not DC, then where, right? Like, this city has less than 1 million people. We know from, hotspots to zip codes exactly who needs services. These are not, like you said, George, it's not that difficult. We know the zip codes. We know where people need to have services available to them, where we need to show up with supports. We know this information. The question is, when is it going to be politically viable enough for people to actually expend their own resources in solving some of this city's problems? Because it's a small city. Like, if we can't do it here, with the kind of wealth we have and the resources and frankly, the, intellectual capital, then where else is it really going to happen? I think that, the city really needs to see themselves as an incubator for change.
Well, policymakers in this city are afraid to use the word reparations. They're afraid to tax people. The truth of the matter is it takes courage to take on these problems, but we know that we have to do something about income inequality in this city, that it is the thing that is driving everything else. And again, as Jessica said, if you can't do it in DC, and if people can't do it today, if our leaders aren't willing to say, today, we are going to prioritize Black lives, we're going to make sure that we do something about the income inequality that's played itself out in the city. And to be honest with you, we understand that if we do that, when we do that, that we'll be taking care of the entire city. There's a term that that John Powell, I think, is famous for having coined, which is it's called targeted universalism. And what targeted universalism talks about is we're going to target one community because we know about the disparities that they experience, but it's going to have universal impact. Everybody's going to benefit. If we take care of the folks in Southeast DC, the children are going to do better. This city is going to do better. And our leaders, it is time to really, I think that they take some courage, but I'm not even sure how much courage it takes. It's just time to speak on behalf of the folks that we know who have been disadvantaged for centuries in this country, and to say it is our time right now to do what's right.
I couldn't agree more with all of you. I just want to bridge, and then Greg will jump right to you. I want to add a population that is consistently, in my view, left as invisible, and those are immigrant workers and undocumented workers. Again, because I see the parallels. One of my goals is to make sure that we're not further polarized, because economic insecurity and economic downturn means that either one group or another group gets resources and attention. And I think through a unified front and solidarity, we can make sure no one is left out, whether we're talking about African-American residents or Latino or, residents from many other countries who live in the city. So I want to just raise that voice consistently that, while the mortality rate, COVID is killing African-Americans, 75% of the deaths have been African-American, while African-Americans are only 50% of the city. But the infection rate continues to be off the charts for the Latino community for all the reasons we know. They're essential workers, they're in crowded housing environments, they face housing and food insecurity. So I want to just keep them present in this conversation. So I want to turn to you now. Phrases and terms like reparations, abolition, defund the police. Greg, I want to jump off with you. Where do you think these terms are taking us, right? What do people need to understand about it? Because it seems to be part of the racial justice conversation now.
Yeah, I think these terms are definitely hot terms, and they give you the hot take and it gets you the front page news article you want, and a lot of activists are running with it, and I salute that. But I also think what people are really asking for is investing in our communities, right? We don't want to move the money into a bicycle program. No, we want to move it into how do we prevent violence? How do we uplift our communities? How do we build in a way where we don't need police storming in over a $20 counterfeit bill, or storming in our houses looking for some criminal, how do we get to that point in a way that uplifts the community, that centers the community and empowers the community, versus empowering the community being policed, patrolled, and eventually incarcerated, And so I think that is really where the message lies. And a lot of leaders, I think we spoke earlier, Jessica said, why not DC? There's a lot of cities who have taken that to heart and are doing it, and I hope that DC will be one of those. But there are places like Austin, Texas now that are today voting on major movements to move dollars into investing in communities. The state of Illinois just announced the Reinvest, Recover, and Renew program that moves all of their funding from marijuana taxes into the communities that have been heaviest hit by gun violence and mass incarceration. Like in St. Louis, Missouri, every single ticket that they get from someone who parked illegally goes into a fund that helps people who are growing up in public school conditions have a scholarship fund when they graduate public schooling. So there are leaders across the country that are thinking innovatively about how do we move our dollars into these communities that uplift the people who are most traumatized. But I haven't seen it here yet, at least not as of late. We do have some shining examples like the Pathways program and the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. I was blessed enough to work alongside them for a while, and they have outstanding results by focusing on the people who are most at risk or most impacted by gun violence on either side of the gun, and really helping them to develop new pathways and new ways to live the life that they want to lead out of the streets and away from violence and away from harming others or away from being harmed. And it's extremely successful. But again, it's an underfunded small program versus some of these larger, law enforcement and crime control approaches that the city has poured more dollars into. And so I think what you're seeing in the protesters is kind of just the raw statements that get you the press. But from us as policy leaders, as leaders in our own respective areas, we got to see what a protester is yelling for. You got to see what that looks like with policy, what that looks like in your appropriations, in your budget, and what that eventually looks like in your city. And if we can't translate that, then I think that's a shortcoming of the leaders, not the people.
Well, but I want to, again, push harder, right? Because Jessica and I had this very conversation, right? I think the defund the police or the reparations is calling for a bright line to say, negotiating with racism, negotiating change is off the table now. We want a new standard, right? We want a no harm standard if the state intervention shows up at your door, right? If someone in a uniform shows up at your door as a representative of your government, there has to be a standard of no harm, and also an awareness that you're there to assist and to provide care and not pull the trigger, right? So I'm just putting in these very raw terms because it seems to me that the movement is saying we don't want to wait anymore. We need a shift in the conversation away from how do we make it better to how do we transform it? So Jessica, I wanted you to jump in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I personally consider myself an abolitionist, and I welcome the conversations I'm hearing and people really grappling with what this idea of abolition means for them, how to apply it, where to learn more. I think that.
Can you say what it means, Jessica? Like, just lay it out, break it down.
So I think it means different things for lots of people. But for me, it means the abolition of this systemic racism and mass incarceration system. The system was born from chattel slavery. And if any of us believes that we would, have been fighting against slavery, and then, we should consider if now is the time to be fighting against this system that was born from slavery, which is our, mass incarceration system. And it starts with lots of things, right? There's a long pipeline. But for me, it really looks like, and I think what it is it's a dismantling. It's, it's not to say, I think it's a spectrum for people, right? It's like, for me, it's how to envision a world where we don't have cages and people aren't exploited, where there is a harm reduction model applied to when people are at your door or in service to you. I think that's where my work lies. That's where I show up every day. That's how I show up. I show up by including the people who are most impacted. I show up by calling people in and, learning together on this journey that many people have laughed at us about from the beginning. But I think there has to be a spectrum and a continuum of people pushing for the most radical ideas, because we know that at some point these moments will bring us into focus in which to make them more mainstream. And I think that is our call. Is
decarceration one of those ideas where we take, I mean, I've heard that, there's a movement to let folks that are incarcerated over 70, for example, who have already served, a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, and, they're no longer a harm to society, to release them from prison, right? Is that what decarceration brings us, or young people who are just too young at the time of the arrest and conviction, to give them another chance? Like, what does decarceration look like?
So decarceration looks like getting people out of the system, shrinking the system, making a much smaller footprint of the system, in which then, I think a lot of abolitionists see as an opportunity to then close the door on the system, right? Shrinking that so that we are dealing with, kind of what's left and how to manage that in our society. So decarceration is a lot of things. People talk about it in the ways around drug offenses, right? So low-level drug offenders you hear a lot about in terms of getting people out who, shouldn't be there because it's not a violent crime. And I think, there's real fault in creating those lines between violent and nonviolent folks. It's the same as like the good versus bad immigrant. We know that 95% of our people are coming home, no matter how they're charged. And again, I think it comes back to this idea of, how do we want them coming home? Do we want them coming home whole or broken? And I think that is the question. And I think that if we don't challenge ourselves to create those systems to bring people home and to not have them go back, we're here now. We're in this place. We don't want to go back. We want to move forward, and we want to move forward in progressing our communities to have some equitable treatment, right? To really realize these goals of racial justice around creating systemic, the kind of systemic fair treatment of the most disenfranchised. Like, if we can, provide that to the weakest among us, then we become the strongest. And I think, this is a lot of this work in the poverty movement is the same. It's like we have to start with our most vulnerable populations. And those include people in our communities and behind the bars.
Well, and I would say that, when you talk about how I describe people who have been incarcerated, it wouldn't necessarily be about, and I know you weren't trying to sort of label somebody weak, but to me, it would be more about how oppressed a group of people have been. When you talk about the system that Jessica has described, and then think about, sending people home after that kind of trauma and oppression, and then you have rules and policies and practices that just exacerbate it. Everything. And I know DC tends to be a little bit less draconian, but maybe not much in terms of where people can live and whether or not they can live in public housing and voting rights. And again, DC a little bit more liberal. But the point is that there is systematic oppression that follows people out of prison, whereas in an equitable world, you would give people who've already been oppressed more support, not less. More efforts need to be made for them to succeed. It is just how it works. Equity is not about equality, and it's certainly not about punishment. That if you are going to give people a chance to succeed, you need an equitable redress to their challenges. And we know what their challenges are. If you're coming out of prison, housing is going to be a huge crisis and a huge challenge. And our leaders have to intentionally address that. We have to be, explicit that is one of the things you have to take on. By the way, Monica, I also appreciate what you said about a coalition between the Latinx community and the Black community and people of color. And at the end of the day, everybody who lives in DC, because again, I really believe that it's in all of our best interest to have equitable redress and support to communities that live in this city. If you want this to be a world-class city, it doesn't make any sense to want some portion of your city to be oppressed and at risk, because everybody's at risk when that's the case. You know, you can't.
Exactly, George. No, and that's why I appreciate you so much. You and I have sat at the table many times to talk about what real racial equity means. And those are hard conversations. And it means that somebody has to give up something.
They do.
And, you know, people who are comfortable,
we're talking
comfortable.
about people who got plenty to give up.
That's
right. When you're talking about a city where people have 81 times the wealth of another group.
That's right.
You have to give up something and you don't lose anything. I mean, that's the way I think about it is, you
gain from it, right? George, you gain because we're all safer.
We're not talking about somebody moving into poverty so somebody else can get out.
That's right.
About people who have more than enough. I mean, I don't want to knock our mayor, but I saw her quoted and say something about what she wants to be remembered as is that a person who wanted a fair DC for everyone. But the problem with that is that's like saying Black lives, that all lives matter. That it is some people already have more fairness than they can use. Like everybody doesn't need fairness in the city because they've got abundance of fairness. And we need leaders who are going to say, I want to make it a fair city for people for whom it's unfair to right now.
Yeah,
I agree, George, because I think that, you know, the pathways to the middle class, you know, it's too little too late. I think that what we need is, you know, housing security, healthcare access, and food security before somebody can decide, you know, what interest rate they want to pay on the house they want to buy. There's a lot of things that have to happen first. But Greg, you were going to jump in too.
No, this is great. I think I was just nodding. And
I actually, not to belabor the point around decarceration, but just to break it down a little further for folks, is that even if this country reduced its prison population by 50%, so by 1 million people, we would still be the global outlier in mass incarceration.
That's right. That's right. And 1 out of 6 DC residents is a returning citizen. Because in my former job, you know, at the Office of Human Rights, we enforced the laws that stopped businesses from discriminating against potential employees that were returning citizens, but also landlords who wanted to do a background check, basically a standard background check, right? But that stops people from getting a job and having a place to live. And if 1 out of 6 DC residents is looking for a place to live and a job because they're coming back from serving their time, you know, where do we leave them, right, George? It's more punitive. It undermines their ability to successfully re-enter the life that they want to live with dignity and respect. You know, I have a friend who talks about, you know, when he came home from prison, and I've been working in the prison system for many years. It has a very soft spot in my heart. You know, found himself eating out of a garbage can because he wasn't allowed to go back to his relative's home. You know, what are we saying to people about the value of their lives when they have to stand outside of a home where they might be able to be well received and cared for and eat out of a garbage can as they're welcome back to the community? Like, that's not okay. I believe we also closed the last transitional housing location for returning men in the district, and they have to go to Baltimore. So, you know, no money in your pocket, and you've got to be, you know, 50 miles away from your home city. I mean, these are just some examples, right? But it is so punitive at every step in the process.
Yeah, but can I just jump in on this because I'm on the board of the Free Minds Book Club and Writing Workshop, and we obviously serve the population both at the jail and the BOP. And you know, when COVID hit, 87% of our Free Minds members lost their jobs. So they have been a really hard time, you know, caring for their families. But when you look at the punitive aspect of the prison system, that, you know, DC doesn't have a prison system. We have a jail. So anybody who is sentenced to a long-term sentence, prison sentence, they can spend up to a year or so at the jail, but then they're transferred to a federal facility. And we took 18 families, I believe, out to Devil's Lake, North Dakota, for families to see their children who were incarcerated in a BOP youth facility there, because we can't keep our folks close to home because they get transferred all over the country. And it makes, it's a huge challenge for people to maintain any kind of relationships when phone calls aren't free and visitation is, limited and people don't get to visit each other. The DC jail is moved to a video visitation. So I think there's a lot of things, here in the district where, we're perceived very much as progressive when it comes to policies. But, what I see over and over again is very regressive policies in a very blue base. And there's a really big hole for improvement here.
Yes, Greg, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think a big challenge with a lot of these ideas is that we're so used to it. I think our city is so used to business as usual. And I really think, we need leaders like you all to kind of show people there are different models. There are ways to decarcerate that doesn't increase crime. There's ways to reduce violence that doesn't increase incarceration. But we don't see those new ideas. I'll never forget. Visiting some of the high schools near my house, and it was just accepted that the dropout rate was over 30%. Accepted. To me, that's a state of emergency. But it's just that's how it is. And I really think there needs to be a ton of education, a ton of leadership, and specifically from our policymakers to start to show people this is how we can rethink and be more innovative and do this in a way that makes us really leaders and uplifts our communities, because folks have unfortunately accepted a lot of the oppression that our system has really pushed people into for way too long, really for generations now. And it's really tough. I just look at my street every day and I'm like, man, this is just business as usual when I know there's a better way to do this. And I'm just excited to be in this conversation. I'm nodding a lot because I'm learning a lot too while we're talking.
This is amazing. I think we should keep doing these and check in every month. But so we have a few more minutes. Our listening audience, if you would like to ask a question of this amazing panel, please feel free to do that. I will be sent the questions and then I can ask the question for you. But I want to add a ray of hope, right? So 30 years ago when I started my work in DC, I thought I was going to work at the public defender, representing kids charged with crimes. But I discovered that it was too late by the time the child had been in the system 2, 3, 4 rounds. So I got out to do youth work and violence prevention work. And I know that we couldn't reach every young person, but I see some of those young people today, right, with their kids, living a good life, a safe life, making great choices. It's a really reasonable investment in young people to say, let's put somebody in your life that is your champion. Let's help you get through school, whatever that looks like, right? You don't have to go to college, but you might want to get your GED just in case. So you're in a good place to make choices later, to make sure that that young person has a safe place to live. If they're LGBTQ, right? What kind of crisis are they facing with their family or their communities? So these investments in young people, they work. We get results. We have to do it. I keep hearing story after story like, little Kevin was my neighbor and then grew up, and now he's, in trouble with the police and he's involved in things. How do I help? This is what I hear people say over and over every week in DC, literally every week. So what are some hopeful models for change, with a racial justice lens, which meaning that we prioritize Black and brown people and poor people? That's what it means to me. How do we get involved in a way that really makes a difference?
I think one thing is challenging the police that police can answer all the calls and be the answer to all the problems. I
so
think
911, not the answer.
Not the answer. I think it's investments in communities and neighbors, right? You have to be comfortable feeling like, okay, I can go to my neighbors and, start to organize among them so that we create our own safety nets for ourselves and the children that live here. I think, there's lots of models around the country where these kind of community organizing models exist and have been wildly successful. But it takes people having to get out of their house and talking to people and learning about people, so that if there is a problem, it's a knock on the door from a neighbor, not the police. And I think the restorative justice models that we've seen, where it's somebody had a transgression against another person, you come together to talk about it, and that person gets to talk about how they were harmed, and the other person gets to hear how that affected their lives. And then real solutions are built around that model, and then people are made whole, right? And they're not seeing the inside of a jail cell, and they're not, in the back of a police car, and there's real restoration that happens, and relationships are built on that. And I think that, there are successful models.
So just because we have, a few minutes left, so let's go make sure everyone gets around here on what are some successful models, what are some solutions that Greg, George, that you see, and then we'll do a round of final comments.
Well, I know I'm not oftentimes very specific about the redress, but sometimes I'm even agnostic about it. If I were the mayor of this city, this is what I want to say. If I were the mayor of this city, I would declare that in 10, 15 years, we are going to eliminate every socioeconomic disparity that people of color are experiencing. That's my pledge. And what I would say is, if it takes defunding the police, if it takes building affordable housing 10-fold times what we're doing, the truth of the matter is we need a vision first. We need a vision for an anti-racist city. And then we need to work our asses off, excuse my French, to make it happen. We could do that in this city. Everybody said we've got the right politics, we've got the wealth. We need a vision. And I think some of my friends disagree, like, oh, it doesn't have to be the mayor. I think that the mayor should be the person to stand up that vision, to say things like reparations, to say things like anti-racist city, to be the one to set the standard for what this city could really set the example for this country. And that's what I really wish we would do.
So we need vision. I love it. I love it. Greg, what about you?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, the vision is huge. There are cities that are building out comprehensive plans of how they're creating equitable community across their cities that helps everyone. And I don't know if we have that right now. And we need that. We need that when we're thinking about violence, when we think about all of the different disparities. I think the second big thing is we have to continue to invest in programs that proactively seek out and support those people who are most vulnerable or most at risk, like the Pathways program, both the one in the one's office and the one in the Department of Employment Services. We need to invest in those programs and beef and build those up so that the people who are experiencing the worst of what our city has to offer, at least hopefully they're getting the best of what government has to offer. I think the same thing with education right now, the fact that we are funding schools by pupil size, but not by what's needed to make that school successful, is a big breakdown. And we're seeing the schools that are maybe aren't the most popular or most supported are the ones that are, just falling apart literally and leaving those children behind. Mm-hmm. The last one, I think, is there really needs to be a real ecological approach to our neighborhoods. Someone has to step up and look at each neighborhood and figure out how do we improve the quality of life there. And it doesn't mean build a big high rise. It doesn't mean build this fancy library. It means let's look at the living conditions and what is creating some of these negative risk factors and risk behaviors that are fueling this cycle, and really step in and change that in a proactive way, not after the shooting, not after some big scandal, not after a housing complex sets on fire, but what are we doing proactively? And so those are the big things I would offer.
Excellent. Jessica?
No, I was just going to say, I think, talking about trauma, we are not going to unpack any of this until we talk about historical and personal trauma that our communities face and have. And I think, a lot of these things get to that, but I think, we can't pretend it doesn't exist.
Absolutely. And with that, I want to kick off our final comments as we say goodbye. Again, it's been such a privilege to have this really raw, transparent conversation today. I think a lot of us, have experienced the trauma of COVID. I would say that it's night and day depending on, your life up to the point, your pre-COVID life, I think, has set you up either for success or further trauma during COVID. So many people are carrying such a heavy load now. So I want to give a shout out to those heroes, those families, those individuals who are really holding it together for themselves and their families during this period. Trauma cannot be underestimated. And George, to your point, we need an aggressive, ambitious vision, right? To be an anti-racist city, to be a city that, as you say, Greg, gives the best to the people who have the least. Right. And I like that in a nutshell. We have to give our very best to the people that have the least. And I don't think we're there. I think that we're still in damage control mode. Right. Yeah. And we're still in sort of that, response mode that is, control the person causing the harm, as opposed to understanding why the harm keeps happening. So this conversation has been fantastic. Any closing words to our listeners about your work or how you'd like to hear from folks if they want to follow up with you?
I hope everybody commits to themselves, to living in an anti-racist way, to committing to that, which means if you're connected to an institution within your family, like everybody's got work to do when it comes to being anti-racist. Take a racial equity training. It's critical to understand why things like reparations and defunding the police. You started off by asking, how do people understand that? There's a way to understand it. You need to get training. It's not always intuitive, but if you do the work and commit to it, you'll understand it and get behind this idea of creating this city as an anti-racist city.
And George, your organization is doing great work. I encourage anyone who can to please donate to Bread for the City. I know that during the holidays every year, that's a gift that I give to myself, is sharing some of what I have with the Bread family. So George, thank you so much for your work. Greg, final words?
Yes. No, I think a big thing for people who are viewing this, just know that we each play a part. And there's no such thing as small change, whether that's just meeting your neighbors and being supportive, volunteering at your local school, or pushing for certain policies. And at Community Justice Action Fund, our whole focus is how do we ensure the community is leading the change and getting leaders and finances and support and resources to empower the community to make a difference, to address gun violence and other inequalities. And so hopefully, you find your own way to take action, and you can definitely follow us at cjactionfund.org or CJ Action Fund on social media to learn more about how you can get involved with some of these policy fights, local and federally. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Jessica?
No, I mean, echo everything you all have said about really doing the work, partnering, reaching out. I am here locally. You can find me at unlocktheboxcampaign.org. I'd love to talk with folks about how to do this work better, stronger, and together, because we are, in this together, whether we want to believe that or not. It's going to take all of us. So let's work together to do it.
Absolutely. And Jessica, your work is really inspiring to me because when I think of the fact that so many of the folks in prison are being put in solitary confinement because of COVID, not for causing any harm to anyone. That really breaks my heart, and I think people need to know about that. So in closing, I do want to add that racial justice is a central message of my campaign as I run for the at-large seat on the DC Council this November. And I want to, people often ask me, Monica, why are you running for office? You've been able to do good work. Why didn't you stay where you were? Why take on this big challenge? And in a nutshell, I'm tired of people being crushed. I'm tired of people not getting what they need from a system that's supposedly, the strongest, healthiest government in the world. And we sit in the heartbeat of the nation. And I think that we can do a lot better. So I'm running to make sure that no one gets left behind and that we stop reinforcing systems that end up destroying people's lives. We need to stop that. And as your elected councilwoman, I plan to lead the charge in those efforts. So I want to say thank you again to everyone. Thank you for your work. I hope that everyone who's listening stays in touch with Bread for the City, with the Community Justice Action Fund, and with the Unlock the Box campaign through these three amazing leaders. And we'll be doing more on this topic as part of my work to guide us and open the door to working together and creating solidarity as we face any crisis together. So everybody stay safe, take care, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.